Which weather control conspiracy theory sounds like a fact? Story 1 on October 13, 1947. A joint General Electric and U.S. military aircraft flew into an Atlantic hurricane, moving harmlessly away from land, dropped about 80 kilograms of dry ice into its clouds, and watched. Within hours, the storm, which had been curving away from the coast, abruptly changed direction. It made landfall near Savannah, Georgia, causing significant damage. The experiment was called Project Cirrus, and it was real. The team led by GE scientists Irving Langmuir and Vincent Schaefer had already demonstrated that dry ice could induce ice crystal formation in supercooled clouds, triggering precipitation. This was one of the first practical demonstrations of weather modification technology, and they had decided to test it on a live hurricane. The aftermath was messy in every sense. Residents of Georgia and South Carolina filed lawsuits against the government. The military convened scientific reviews. The specific question, did the dry ice seeding cause the course change, or was the storm already turning independently, was never definitively resolved. The mathematical probability of the storm changing course on its own was calculated and was not negligible. The causal chain was genuinely ambiguous. What happened next set a template that would recur in weather modification history. The program continued quietly. Project Cirrus ran for several more years. The specific 1947 hurricane incident was studied, debated, and eventually classified in ways that made independent evaluation difficult. The lawsuits were navigated. Public knowledge of the program remained limited. The specific thing about Project Cirrus that makes it an anchor for everything else on this list is not that the military definitely caused the hurricane to change course. It is that the military tried to change a hurricane's course. Something happened consistent with what they were trying to cause, and the question of whether they caused it was never cleanly answered. That ambiguity is real. It happened in 1947. Everything built on top of it is taller because the foundation is genuine. Story 2 from 1962 to 1983. The United States government ran Project Storm Fury, a sustained federal research program that seeded hurricanes with silver iodide, with the specific goal of weakening them before they reached inhabited coastlines. This is not a conspiracy theory. It is documented federal science conducted by NOAA and the U.S. Navy, with research flights into actual hurricanes over 2 decades. The theory behind Storm Fury was that silver iodide seeded into the outer rain bands of a hurricane would cause supercooled water to freeze, releasing latent heat and expanding the eye wall, redistributing the storm's energy structure in a way that would reduce peak wind speeds. In several seeded storms, hurricane intensity did decrease measurably after treatment. Whether the decrease was caused by the seeding or by natural storm fluctuation was consistently impossible to confirm. The program was shut down in 1983. The official scientific reasons were twofold. Improved understanding of tropical storm thermodynamics suggested the mechanism might not work as well as originally thought, because tropical hurricanes contain less supercooled water than the theory required, and concerns were raised about the liability implications of a U.S. government program that attempted to modify storms that then made landfall in countries outside American jurisdiction. The liability question is the part that rarely gets discussed, but that is specifically important. The U.S. government was seeding Atlantic hurricanes that could subsequently hit Caribbean nations or Mexico, without those nations' consent, and without any mechanism for establishing causation if something went wrong. The program was discontinued, partly because the legal exposure of conducting sovereign weather modification experiments that crossed international borders had no clean resolution. The data from Storm Fury's 20 years of hurricane seeding is public. The flights happened. The measurements were taken. Whether the seeding worked is genuinely debated. Whether it was stopped because it worked too well is the conspiracy extension. The documented reason for stopping, it was scientifically unresolved and legally complicated, is mundane enough to be credible. Story 3 on the afternoon of August 15, 1952. The town of Lynmouth in North Devon, England, experienced what is still described as one of the most catastrophic flash floods in British history. In a matter of hours, the East and West Lynn rivers, normally placid streams, surged to catastrophic volumes, swept through the town, destroyed over 100 buildings and 130 vehicles, and ended 34 people. The cause was an extraordinary rainfall event, 229 millimeters of rain falling on Exmoor in a single day, 9 inches of water over the saturated moorland draining simultaneously into the river valleys below. The weather was extraordinary. What British records subsequently revealed is that it was also a period during which the Royal Air Force was conducting secret cloud seeding experiments called Operation Cumulus, using silver iodide and dry ice dropped from aircraft to investigate the possibility of increasing rainfall. Operation Cumulus is real. The RAF conducted cloud seeding flights over southern England during 1952. The specific question, whether any of these flights were conducted in proximity to Exmoor before the Lynmouth flood, is one that official records have never fully resolved. Documents available under the Freedom of Information Act reference the program, but are incomplete regarding specific dates and locations. Former RAF pilots have given accounts suggesting flights over the Exmoor area shortly before the flood. The Ministry of Defense has maintained that no connection has been established. The investigative journalism and parliamentary questions that have pursued this story over decades have not produced a definitive answer. The meteorological conditions that produced the Lynmouth flood are consistent with a natural extreme event. They are also consistent with what cloud seeding of an already saturated system might have produced. 34 people died in Lynmouth. A secret British weather modification program was operating in the same region at the same time. Whether one caused the other is the question that official records have never been sufficient to answer and may now be unanswerable. Story 4: The story of Operation Popeye belongs on any serious list of weather control history because it is the event that proves weather modification was used as a weapon of war by a major power in modern history. This is not contested. It is documented, confirmed by multiple government investigations, and was the direct cause of an international treaty that would not otherwise exist. From 1967 to 1972, U.S. aircraft flew cloud seeding missions over the Ho Chi Minh Trail in Laos, Cambodia, and Vietnam during the monsoon season. The operation's stated objective was to extend the natural monsoon by several weeks, increasing rainfall over the supply trail to the point where road surfaces became impassable for the supply trucks that sustained North Vietnamese forces in the south. The program's internal slogan was "Make mud, not war." The operation was kept secret from Congress and from the American public. It was exposed in 1972 by journalist Seymour Hersh, who obtained leaked documents describing the program. Senate hearings followed. The administration acknowledged the program. The specific consequence was the 1977 Environmental Modification Convention, the ENMOD Treaty, negotiated through the United Nations and signed by multiple nations, explicitly prohibiting the military or hostile use of environmental modification techniques. An international treaty was written specifically because Operation Popeye had demonstrated that a sovereign government would weaponize rainfall if it believed doing so served its strategic interests. What Operation Popeye established for all subsequent weather modification history is a specific and important precedent. It is not paranoid to believe that governments will use weather modification as a weapon. A government did it. The evidence is in congressional records. The treaty written to prevent recurrence is a public international document. The question for every subsequent theory on this list is not whether governments would do this. They demonstrably would. Story 5: The People's Republic of China operates the largest government weather modification program in the world, and it operates it openly. The China Meteorological Administration's Weather Modification Office employs approximately 37,000 people, operates dozens of aircraft and thousands of rocket and artillery launching systems across the country, and has spent decades developing and refining cloud seeding and precipitation enhancement technology for agricultural, water resource, and urban management applications. This is not classified. China publishes reports on its weather modification activities. The program's scale and operational history are documented in peer-reviewed meteorological literature. Chinese government statements describe plans to expand weather modification coverage to include approximately 60% of the country's total land area by 2025. The specific event that brought China's weather modification program to international attention was the 2008 Beijing Olympics. Chinese authorities used rocket-based cloud seeding to seed clouds upwind of Beijing before they could produce rain over the Olympic venues, forcing precipitation earlier and ensuring clear skies over the opening ceremony. The operation was openly described in Chinese state media. Foreign journalists covered it. It worked. The question that China's program raises for the rest of this list is specific. China's open program demonstrates that government weather modification at large scale is technically feasible, institutionally manageable, and, when openly acknowledged, publicly acceptable. Every theory about what other governments might be doing, covertly, exists in the context of what China is openly demonstrating as possible. The 2021 Henan floods ended over 300 people in one of China's worst flooding disasters in decades. Following the floods, online speculation circulated that cloud seeding operations had contributed to the extreme precipitation, and that, if so, this had not been disclosed. Chinese authorities denied this. Whether or not the specific Henan speculation is accurate, it illustrates the specific epistemic problem that China's large, acknowledged program creates. When extraordinary rainfall occurs in a country that openly seeds clouds, the question of contribution is not obviously irrational to ask. Story 6. Every year on May 9, Russia holds Victory Day parades in Moscow, commemorating the Soviet Union's World War II victory. The parades are significant state occasions involving thousands of military personnel, the public display of military hardware, and extensive television coverage. They also, for decades, have been preceded by cloud seeding operations specifically designed to ensure clear skies over Moscow's Red Square on Parade Day. Russia's cloud dispersal operations are real and have been openly described by Russian meteorological authorities and state media for years. The method: aircraft fly upwind of Moscow, typically over Tver and Smolensk regions, and seed incoming clouds with silver iodide, liquid nitrogen, or cement powder, forcing precipitation to fall before the clouds reach the capital. The rain that would otherwise fall on the parade falls on the Russian countryside instead, and Moscow gets clear skies. The practice has been used not just for Victory Day, but for other significant Moscow events, and the Russian Meteorological Agency has been quite open about the technology and its application. This is government weather control applied domestically, openly, for political and ceremonial purposes, using industrial quantities of chemical seeding agents distributed over populated rural areas without those areas' specific consent. The Russian operation makes several things visible that are usually obscured in discussions of weather modification. It demonstrates that the technology works reliably enough to be routinely deployed for high-stakes public events where failure would be embarrassing. It demonstrates that governments are comfortable making unilateral decisions to redirect precipitation from one area to another for purposes of national image. And it demonstrates that the populations in the areas where the precipitation is redirected are not consulted. Whether Russia's Parade Day seeding is categorically different from the kind of weather manipulation that conspiracy theories allege about other governments is a question worth sitting with. Story 7. The United Arab Emirates is one of the most water-stressed countries on Earth. Average annual rainfall in the UAE is approximately 100 millimeters, concentrated in unpredictable winter events. Groundwater resources are severely depleted from decades of extraction at rates that exceed natural recharge. The country has invested heavily in desalination, which provides the majority of potable water but requires enormous energy expenditure and has significant environmental costs. Against this background, the UAE has operated an active cloud seeding program since 2002, currently managed by the UAE National Center of Meteorology. The program uses aircraft that deploy salt flares into clouds, seeding them to encourage coalescence of water droplets and precipitation. It is one of the most active and technically sophisticated cloud seeding operations in the world outside China, with multiple aircraft, an extensive ground observation network, and ongoing research partnerships with international meteorological organizations. In April 2024, Dubai experienced unprecedented flooding. A storm produced more rainfall in a single day than the city typically receives in a year and a half, inundating roads, flooding homes, and a major international airport, and causing significant disruption and damage. Immediately following the flood, widespread speculation circulated attributing the extraordinary rainfall to the UAE's cloud seeding program, the theory being that seeding operations had amplified a large storm system beyond what would have occurred naturally. UAE meteorological authorities stated that no cloud seeding flights had been conducted in the 24 hours preceding the storm event. Independent meteorological analysis attributed the rainfall to an unusually intense Mediterranean source storm system and noted that the rainfall totals, while extreme for Dubai, were consistent with naturally occurring events of this storm type. The theory persists. The WAY's program is real. The storm was real. Whether the seeding operations that did not occur in the 24 hours before the storm might have contributed during earlier seeding flights is a question that the available data does not definitively answer. Story 8, the Environmental Modification Convention, commonly called the ENMOD Treaty, was opened for signature in 1977 and entered into force in 1978. It has been signed by 78 nations. Its specific prohibition: parties to the convention are forbidden from engaging in military or hostile use of environmental modification techniques having widespread, long-lasting, or severe effects as a means of destruction, damage, or injury to any other state party. The treaty exists because Operation Popeye proved that the United States would weaponize rainfall. The specific causal sequence is documented. The Senate hearings that followed the program's exposure in 1972 established the factual record. The international diplomatic discussions that followed acknowledged the precedent, and the ENMOD Convention was the formal international legal response to the demonstrated reality. Several things about the ENMOD Treaty are worth noting for their implications beyond the treaty's text. The treaty bans techniques with widespread, long-lasting, or severe effects, a threshold that is not clearly defined, and that implicitly permits techniques whose effects are localized, brief, or moderate. The operational programs conducted by the United States, Russia, China, and others that produce controlled, localized precipitation changes are not obviously prohibited by the treaty's text. They operate in the space that the treaty does not reach. The treaty also does not have strong verification or enforcement mechanisms. There is no international inspectorate for weather modification. There is no mechanism by which a state can verify another's compliance. The treaty establishes a norm and creates a legal framework for diplomatic complaint, but its practical deterrent effect depends on the willingness of states to be deterred by reputational and diplomatic consequences. The ENMOD Treaty is the international community's acknowledgement that weather weapons are real enough to require prohibition. It is also a document that tells you something about what the international community thought was probable enough to warrant a treaty when it was negotiated. Story 9, the High Frequency Active Auroral Research Program, HAARP, is a real facility located near Gakona, Alaska, operated by the University of Alaska Fairbanks following its transfer from military management in 2015. It consists of 180 high-frequency antenna elements spread across approximately 14 hectares, capable of transmitting up to 6 megawatts of radio frequency energy into the ionosphere. It is a scientific research facility studying ionospheric physics. HAARP has been the subject of more conspiracy theorizing per square meter of antenna than almost any other scientific installation in the world. Theories associating HAARP with weather control, earthquake induction, mind control, hurricane steering, and various other effects have circulated in fringe communities for decades, and have proven remarkably durable despite the facility's scientific mundanity. The specific scientific reality of HAARP is that it heats a small region of the ionosphere to study its properties, how radio waves propagate, how the aurora interacts with the ionosphere, how artificially induced ionospheric disturbances behave. The energy it transmits is absorbed within the ionosphere and does not reach the ground in a form that could produce the ground-level weather effects that conspiracy theories describe. Independent atmospheric physicists have repeatedly reviewed the physics and found no mechanism by which HAARP-style ionospheric heating could steer hurricanes or trigger earthquakes. The conspiracy theories attached to HAARP predate the facility's construction and would likely have attached to whatever ionospheric research facility was built in the relevant period. The specific persistence of the HAARP theories is partly about the genuinely classified origins of the program, and partly about the specific visual appearance of the antenna array, which looks sufficiently dramatic and purposeful to suggest a weapon, even though it is a scientific instrument. The Sura facility in Russia and the iSCAT system in Northern Europe operate on similar principles and at similar or greater power levels. They receive a fraction of the conspiracy attention, probably because they are less visually distinctive and less associated with the U.S. military. Story 10 stratospheric aerosol injection is a proposed solar geoengineering technique, the injection of reflective particles, most commonly sulfur dioxide, into the stratosphere at altitudes above 15 kilometers, where they would reflect a small percentage of incoming solar radiation back into space, reducing global surface temperature. The technique is explicitly modeled on the natural temperature reductions observed after large volcanic eruptions, which inject massive quantities of sulfur dioxide into the stratosphere as a side effect. The research is real. Multiple universities, research institutes, and government science agencies are studying stratospheric aerosol injection seriously because the modeled effects on global temperature are significant, and because the technique is theoretically among the faster-acting interventions available if climate change produces emergencies requiring rapid response. Harvard's Solar Geoengineering Research Program is the most prominent Western academic program. Its proposed field experiment, called SCOPEX, has been in development for years. The conspiracy theory layer that the academic research programs are cover stories for deployment that is already occurring, and that the persistent contrails observed behind high-altitude aircraft are delivery systems for stratospheric aerosol injection already underway. The chemtrail theory in its most technically sophisticated contemporary form. The specific evidence that stratospheric aerosol injection research exists and that governments are discussing it is real and is part of the theory's sustaining power. The specific gap between the research and the deployment claim is significant. Independently verifiable stratospheric aerosol concentrations have not shown the changes that would be expected from large-scale operational deployment. The atmospheric monitoring that would detect large-scale sulfur injection is global, multi-institutional, and not controlled by any single government or program. Whether the existing research programs represent the cover story for something already operational or genuinely represent the leading edge of what is being seriously considered is a question that the evidence base currently does not support in the deployment direction. Story 11, the redirected hurricane theory. From a real 1947 incident to every major storm since the Project Cirrus 1947 hurricane course change is real. The storm changed direction after being seeded. The causal relationship was never definitively established. That combination, a real event, an ambiguous causal chain, an acknowledged government program, is the foundation on which the redirected hurricane theory is built. The contemporary version of the theory attributes specific named storms, Katrina in 2005, Harvey in 2017, Sandy in 2012, Helene in 2024, to deliberate steering by weather modification technology, with specific narrative claims varying by storm. The Katrina version typically involves claims about deliberate intensification or steering toward New Orleans. The Harvey version involves deliberate steering to produce unprecedented flooding in Houston. The Sandy version involves deliberate steering toward the Northeast American coast before a presidential election. The Helene version has circulated with claims about steering toward Appalachian communities. The specific meteorological evidence against deliberate steering of these storms is the level of understanding required to execute it. The mechanisms by which large storm systems could be reliably steered using currently known cloud seeding technology are not established. Project Cirrus's 1947 course change, assuming it was caused by the seeding, involved a relatively small storm with a trajectory that changed modestly. Modern major hurricanes are thermodynamic systems of enormous complexity and energy, whose paths are determined by interactions between the storm and the large-scale atmospheric circulation patterns surrounding it. No published science establishes a mechanism by which aircraft-based seeding could reliably redirect a system of that scale. The emotional and psychological appeal of the redirected hurricane theory is specific and understandable. The idea that the catastrophic destruction of a community was deliberate rather than natural provides a target for the anger that catastrophic loss produces. Whether that provides a community with something meaningful or something damaging to believe is a different question from whether it's true. Story 12, Wilhelm Reich's Cloudbuster. The EFTA burned his books and people still think he was onto something. Wilhelm Reich was a psychoanalyst and student of Freud who, over a scientific career that began in legitimate psychiatric research, developed a theory about a universal life energy he called orgone. By the early 1950s, he was claiming that orgone energy permeated the atmosphere, that its concentration and flow determined weather patterns, and that a device he had built, the Cloudbuster, consisting of hollow metal tubes connected to running water and pointed at the sky, could manipulate atmospheric orgone to produce or disperse rain. Reich conducted experiments in the Maine woods and at one point claimed to have broken a drought in the area using the Cloudbuster. He also claimed to have engaged in battles with extraterrestrial forces he called the emotional plague of cosmic evil. His scientific claims were contested by essentially the entire scientific community outside his own followers. The FDA began investigating Reich in 1947 for interstate commerce violations related to his claims about orgone accumulators as health devices. In 1956, a federal court issued an injunction against him, and FDA agents supervised the destruction of his equipment and the burning of his publications, an episode that is genuinely extraordinary in American regulatory history. Reich died in federal prison in 1957 while serving a sentence for contempt of court related to the injunction. The burning of books by a U.S. regulatory agency in the 1950s is the specific fact that has sustained fringe interest in Reich's work. It produced exactly the cultural response that burning books always produces, a community of people who believed that the destruction of the material was evidence of its importance. Reich's atmospheric orgone theories have no support in physics. His Cloudbuster has no documented effect on precipitation in any controlled test. The FDA's actions, while genuinely unusual and worth criticizing as regulatory overreach, were not evidence that his weather control technology worked. Story 13, Tesla and Tunguska. Did Wardenclyffe's energy beam cause the 1908 Siberian explosion? On June 30, 1908, something exploded approximately 8 to 10 kilometers above the Podkamennaya Tunguska River in remote Siberia, flattening approximately 2,000 square kilometers of forest and registering on seismographs across Europe. The explosion produced approximately the energy of a 10-15 megaton nuclear device. No impact crater was found. No significant fragments of extraterrestrial material were recovered at the time. The mainstream scientific explanation that the Tunguska event was caused by the airburst of a small comet or asteroid, approximately 50-80 meters in diameter, that disintegrated in the atmosphere before reaching the surface, is consistent with all available physical evidence and with subsequent atmospheric modeling of airburst dynamics. This explanation is accepted by essentially all planetary scientists who work on near-Earth objects. The Tesla-Tunguska theory holds that the explosion was caused by Nikola Tesla's Wardenclyffe Tower, his ambitious wireless energy transmission project on Long Island, which was still under construction and ultimately never completed, having lost its funding from J.P. Morgan in 1903. The theory proposes that Tesla tested the tower's energy transmission capability by directing a beam of wireless energy toward the Arctic, that the beam intersected with the Siberian atmosphere on June 30, 1908, and that the result was the explosion. The specific problems with this theory are numerous and specific. The Wardenclyffe Tower was not operational in any meaningful sense in 1908, having been abandoned several years earlier. The physics of wireless energy transmission as Tesla envisioned it does not include a mechanism for producing an atmospheric explosion of Tunguska's magnitude. The airburst explanation for Tunguska is fully consistent with all physical observations without requiring Tesla's involvement. What sustains the theory is Tesla's genuine status as an underappreciated and sometimes suppressed innovator, and the specific dramatic appeal of connecting an unsolved mystery to a historical genius. Story 14, the chemtrail patent theory. Real patents filed for weather modification technology are used as proof of deployment. Real patents exist for processes related to atmospheric manipulation. Patents have been filed by universities, defense contractors, and private companies for methods of stratospheric particle injection, ionospheric heating, and various cloud seeding enhancement techniques. These patents are in the public record, searchable through patent databases, and their existence is a confirmed fact. The chemtrail patent theory uses the existence of these real patents as evidence that the technology described in them is already deployed, specifically in the form of the persistent contrails observed behind high-altitude aircraft. The argument is that the patents demonstrate knowledge and intent, and that the operational deployment is the contrails. The specific evidentiary gap in this argument is the relationship between a patent and operational deployment. Patents are filed for technologies that inventors believe to be potentially useful and protectable. They represent the state of development at the time of filing, not confirmation of deployment. The number of technologies that are patented and never commercially or operationally deployed is substantially larger than the number that are patented and deployed. A patent for stratospheric particle injection describes a process someone has described precisely enough to protect. It does not describe a process that has been implemented. The contrail explanation is a matter of basic atmospheric physics. Jet aircraft engines produce water vapor and particulates as combustion byproducts, and under conditions of low temperature and high humidity in the upper atmosphere, this water vapor freezes and forms ice crystals that are visible as condensation trails. Whether those trails persist for minutes or hours depends on the specific atmospheric humidity. In humid conditions, they persist. In dry conditions, they evaporate quickly. This variability is the source of the observation that some contrails disappear and some stay, which the chemtrail theory interprets as evidence of two different types of material being sprayed. The contrail physics are not contested by atmospheric scientists. The patent evidence is real and doesn't establish what the theory needs it to establish. Story 15, Operation Commando Lava. Chemicals turned the Ho Chi Minh Trail to mud. As a weapon of war, Operation Commando Lava is a sibling program to Operation Popeye that receives significantly less historical attention, probably because its mechanism is less elegant and its outcomes are less dramatic. Where Popeye attempted to weaponize rainfall, Commando Lava attempted to weaponize the soil itself by treating sections of the Ho Chi Minh Trail with chemical compounds intended to weaken soil structure, preventing the clay-rich soil from draining effectively and making it turn to impassable mud when wetted. The chemicals used were primarily sodium tripolyphosphate and other soil dispersants that had been developed in the context of agricultural soil science. Applied to trail surfaces from aircraft, the compounds were intended to disrupt the bonding between clay particles, creating a soil that would become deeply sticky and impassable when wet, worse than the natural mud that monsoon rains already produced. The operational results were mixed. The Ho Chi Minh Trail was a complex, adaptive system maintained by thousands of engineers who responded rapidly to obstacles. Chemical soil treatment of sections of the trail produced some local impassability, but the network's redundancy and the repair capacity of the forces maintaining it limited the strategic impact. Commando lava is less well known than Popeye, partly because it represents a different category of environmental manipulation, not weather modification, but soil modification, and partly because the chemicals involved, while unpleasant, are less exotic than silver iodide seeded into hurricanes. It is also less dramatically consequential than Popeye, whose direct provocation of the NMOD Treaty gives it lasting historical significance. But Commando lava is a useful reminder that the U.S. military's experimentation with environmental manipulation during Vietnam extended well beyond the cloud seeding program that attracted the most attention. The instinct to weaponize the environment was systematic rather than exceptional. Story 16, Project Skywater. The government seeded clouds over the American West for 27 years, and almost nobody noticed. Project Skywater was a long-running cloud seeding research program operated by the United States Bureau of Reclamation from 1961 to 1988. Its purpose was straightforward: to investigate whether cloud seeding using silver iodide could increase precipitation over watersheds in the American West, improving snowpack accumulation and river flow for agricultural and municipal water supplies. The program operated for 27 years. It seeded clouds over multiple western states, including Colorado, Nevada, Arizona, and others. It produced research publications, some of which suggested statistically significant precipitation increases in seeded periods versus control periods. It was funded continuously by the federal government throughout its duration, and it operated with almost no public awareness. The Bureau of Reclamation is not a secretive agency. It is the federal water management agency responsible for the infrastructure that waters much of the American West. But Project Skywater existed in a specific institutional space that produced minimal public attention. It was not classified, it was not dramatic, and its potential effects, slightly more mountain snowpack, were not the kind of thing that generated journalistic interest in the way that hurricane steering experiments did. The program was discontinued in 1988. The Bureau of Reclamation's assessment was that while some individual experiments showed statistically significant precipitation enhancement, the evidence for large-scale, reliable, cost-effective weather modification over watersheds was not sufficient to justify continued federal investment. Several western states continued their own cloud seeding programs independently and continue them today using private contractors and state funding. Utah, Colorado, Nevada, and California all operate active cloud seeding programs targeting mountain snowpack. These programs are documented and, in most cases, publicly acknowledged. They are also almost entirely unknown to the general public. Story 17, Fido. Britain burned enormous quantities of fuel alongside runways to boil away fog during World War II fog-intensive dispersal operation. Fido was one of the most operationally important and visually spectacular weather modification systems ever deployed. Between 1943 and 1945, the Royal Air Force installed Fido systems at 15 airfields in Britain, designed to enable bombers returning from missions over Germany to land in the fog that frequently made British airfields unusable. The mechanism was simple and enormous. Pipes running along both sides of a runway were connected to fuel supplies and perforated to allow petrol or aviation fuel to flow out and be ignited. The burning fuel, consuming thousands of liters per hour per side, produced enough heat to evaporate the fog in the immediate vicinity of the runway, creating a corridor of clear air through which aircraft could approach and land. Fido worked. Over the course of its wartime operation, it enabled approximately 2,500 aircraft landings that would otherwise have been impossible, saving an estimated 10,000 airmen who would have had to divert, ditch, or bail out. The fuel consumption was enormous. A single Fido operation at a major airfield could consume fuel that would have powered a substantial bombing mission. but the calculus in terms of aircraft and crew saved was considered favorable. The system's visual effect was described by pilots and observers as one of the most dramatic sights of the war. A runway bordered by walls of flame visible from miles away in the dark, with a clear channel above the burning fuel, where the fog had been driven away by the heat rising from the fire. FIDO is the weather modification technology that is most thoroughly forgotten, probably because it requires no controversial theory. It is just very large fires burning very large quantities of fuel alongside landing strips. It worked. It saved many lives. And it demonstrates that the impulse to modify the immediate atmospheric environment for operational purposes is as old as the technological capacity to do so. Story 18, the post-NMOD continuation theory. Did the U.S. just move Operation Popeye underground after the treaty? The NMOD Treaty of 1977 explicitly prohibited the military or hostile use of environmental modification. The United States signed and ratified it. The question that the post-treaty continuation theory poses is whether signing a treaty means a program stops, or whether it means the program's continued existence becomes worth keeping secret. This is not an irrational question to ask in the specific context of U.S. military program history. The Church Committee investigations of the 1970s documented that intelligence programs which were supposed to have been terminated continued in modified or renamed forms. The CIA's domestic surveillance activities continued under different operational frameworks after legislative constraints were imposed. The general pattern of classified program continuity across changes in legal or political environment is documented rather than speculative. The specific evidence for post-NMOD weather modification continuation is not in the same documentary category as the examples above. There are no revealed documents confirming the continuation of Operation Popeye or an equivalent program. There are patents for atmospheric modification technologies filed by defense contractors after 1977. There are research programs studying weather modification that continue under civilian and defense agency auspices. Neither of these constitutes confirmation of treaty violation. What the continuation theory identifies accurately is the verification problem inherent in the NMOD treaty. There is no international inspectorate, no satellite monitoring system specifically designed to detect cloud seeding operations, and no mechanism by which a state can definitively verify another's compliance. A program conducted from high-altitude aircraft over remote areas would be difficult to detect and verify from outside. The NMOD treaty relies on voluntary compliance, diplomatic consequences for violation, and whatever deterrent effect international law provides. Whether those mechanisms are sufficient to deter a government that believes covert weather modification provides strategic advantage is the question that the available evidence cannot answer. Story 19, directed energy wildfire theory. The 2018 Paradise Fire burns were too precise to be natural. The campfire of November 2018 destroyed the town of Paradise, California, in one of the most destructive wildfires in American history, ending 85 people and burning approximately 18,000 structures. The fire burned with unusual speed and intensity, driven by strong Diablo winds over terrain, made catastrophically dry by years of drought. The specific fire behavior, the speed of spread, the completeness of destruction in some areas, became the subject of directed energy weapon theories within days of the fire. The specific claims circulated on social media and in fringe communities were that the burn patterns were too precise to be explained by wind-driven wildfire, that structures had burned while trees remained standing, that metal had melted in ways inconsistent with normal fire temperatures, and that the overall pattern suggested directed energy weapons rather than an ordinary wildfire. Fire scientists and structural engineers who reviewed these claims produced specific, detailed rebuttals. The pattern of structures burning while vegetation survived is a well-documented feature of wildfire behavior in urban interface zones. Buildings with composite roofing, wood framing, and combustible materials ignite differently from trees, and the specific construction characteristics of most American residential structures make them susceptible to ignition from airborne embers before the main fire front arrives. The specific aluminum components that appeared to have melted were consistent with temperatures achievable in structural fires rather than requiring exotic energy weapons. The overall burn pattern was consistent with computer models of the fire's documented spread under the recorded wind conditions. The directed energy theory is specifically appealing to communities that have experienced catastrophic wildfire loss because it offers an explanation that includes a responsible party and a potential mechanism of prevention. The actual responsible party, the combination of PG&E's power line maintenance failures, decades of inappropriate fire suppression, climate-driven drought, and expanding development in high fire risk zones, is more diffuse and provides less satisfying accountability. PG&E was found liable for the Camp Fire and ultimately paid billions in settlements. The cause was a transmission line failure. Story 20 Sura and iSCAT, the ionospheric heaters nobody talks about that do what HAARP does. The discourse around ionospheric research facilities in conspiracy communities is almost entirely focused on HAARP. The Sura facility in Russia and the iSCAT system distributed across Norway, Sweden, and Finland receive a fraction of the attention despite operating on similar principles and at comparable or greater power levels. The Sura heating facility, operated by the Radiophysical Research Institute in Nizhny Novgorod, Russia, has been conducting ionospheric heating experiments since 1981. It operates at frequencies and power levels comparable to HAARP. It has produced published research on ionospheric modification, plasma physics, and radio wave propagation. It is funded and operated by Russian scientific and military research institutions. iSCAT, the European Incoherent Scatter Scientific Association, operates facilities in Troms, Norway, Kiruna, Sweden, and Sodankel, Finland, funded by a consortium of national science agencies from Norway, Sweden, Finland, Japan, China, and the United Kingdom. iSCAT has operated since 1981 and has produced extensive published research on ionospheric physics. It has an antenna system at Troms with heating capabilities similar to HAARP. The specific asymmetry in conspiracy attention between HAARP and these other facilities is worth examining for what it reveals about how these theories work. HAARP was partly funded through the U.S. Air Force and Navy and has clear military research goals in its original design. Sura was operated by a Soviet institution with military connections. Both are genuine ionospheric research facilities. The dramatic disproportion in conspiracy attention to HAARP versus Sura is probably explained partly by the language barrier and partly by the visual distinctiveness of HAARP's antenna field. The underlying physics of ionospheric heating is the same at all three facilities. None of them produce ground-level weather effects through any established mechanism. Story 21, the China-Tibetan Plateau Water Weapon Theory. Real Geopolitics Meets Weather Control claims the geopolitical reality underlying this theory is significant and genuinely concerning. China controls the Tibetan Plateau, which is the headwaters of most of the major river systems serving South and Southeast Asia. The Brahmaputra, the Salween, the Mekong, the Yellow River, the Yangtze, all of them originate on the Tibetan Plateau. The downstream nations, India, Bangladesh, Myanmar, Thailand, Laos, Cambodia, Vietnam, depend on these river systems for agriculture, drinking water, and hydroelectric power. China's construction of dams and its potential control over water flow is a real and documented source of regional geopolitical tension. This geopolitical reality is the legitimate foundation for the theory. The extension that China's weather modification infrastructure, the world's largest government weather modification program, is specifically targeted at the Tibetan Plateau and surrounding regions to manipulate precipitation in ways that reduce water flow to downstream nations, functioning as a strategic water weapon. The published Chinese weather modification program objectives focus on increasing precipitation over Chinese agricultural regions and improving water resources within China's borders. The program's stated priorities include Tibetan Plateau watershed enhancement, which could plausibly affect downstream hydrology. Whether Chinese weather modification activities are producing measurable effects on transboundary river flows is a question that requires hydrological data across multiple countries and long-time series to evaluate. Whether those effects, if they exist, are intentionally directed at downstream nations, as opposed to being incidental effects of domestic water resource management, is a question of intent that the available evidence cannot address. The real geopolitical concern about Chinese water infrastructure on the Tibetan Plateau is warranted. The specific extension to active weather weapon targeting of downstream nations is an inference beyond what the evidence supports, though it is not an inference that the geopolitical context makes obviously irrational. Story 22, Russia's hail suppression rockets, and the theory that they're used to destroy neighbors' crops. Russia, Georgia, and several other post-Soviet states operate extensive hail suppression programs that use rockets or aircraft to seed storm cells approaching agricultural areas with silver iodide, encouraging precipitation to fall as rain rather than large hailstones. These programs protect vineyards, orchards, and grain crops from hail damage and represent a practical and economically motivated application of cloud seeding technology that has been in operation for decades. The specific mechanism, rockets carrying silver iodide charges, are fired into the base of cumulonimbus clouds producing or likely to produce hail. The silver iodide provides additional ice crystal nucleation sites, encouraging the formation of smaller ice particles that fall as rain rather than the larger hailstones that produce agricultural damage. The fringe theory attached to these real programs, that the hail suppression rockets of one country can be deliberately redirected to seed storm cells over a neighboring country's territory, increasing rainfall and causing flooding or crop damage as an act of covert agricultural warfare. Georgia has at various points raised concerns about whether Russian hail suppression operations have inadvertently or deliberately increased precipitation on Georgian territory. The specific physics of the claim are more plausible than many weather modification theories because the mechanism is real and the operational systems are genuinely in use. Whether directing a hail suppression rocket slightly differently could produce meaningful precipitation increases over a neighboring territory is a more technically credible question than, for example, whether HARP can steer hurricanes. The geopolitical context of Russia-Georgia relations and the real operational hail suppression infrastructure on both sides make this a theory with a more solid technical and political foundation than most on this list. Whether it has been operationally used as agricultural sabotage is unconfirmed. Story 23, Weather Balloon Seeding Fleet Theory. Are daily atmospheric sensors also delivering particles? Approximately 900 weather balloons are launched twice daily by meteorological agencies around the world, every day, at 0000 and 1200 UTC. They carry radio sondes, packages of instruments measuring temperature, humidity, pressure, and wind that transmit data to ground stations as the balloon ascends from the surface to the stratosphere, where the balloon bursts and the radiosonde descends on a parachute. This global upper atmosphere observing network is the backbone of weather forecasting and has operated continuously since the mid-20th century. The theory, the routine weather balloons are not pure observation platforms, but also carry seeding agents that are released at altitude, making the global balloon network a distributed, low-visibility cloud seeding delivery system operating under the cover of routine meteorological observation. The theory has a specific appeal because the balloon network is real, genuinely global, requires no explanation to justify its existence, and would be very difficult to monitor. If you wanted to maintain a covert atmospheric seeding program at global scale, a system that already launches 900 platforms daily into the upper atmosphere, with legitimate documented purposes for doing so, would be a structurally elegant delivery mechanism. The specific evidence against the theory is that the radio sondes carried by weather balloons are independently designed, manufactured, and verified by many different national meteorological agencies and private manufacturers. The instrument packages are not controlled by a single organization. The data they produce is validated against independent satellite observations, aircraft measurements, and other observational systems. A covert seeding payload would need to be incorporated across a diverse international supply chain without producing detectable anomalies in the instrument data, and without the many engineers and meteorologists who work directly with radiosonde systems reporting anything unusual. The theory requires a level of coordinated covert action across independent international agencies that the observable behavior of those agencies does not suggest. Story 24, Arecibo Observatory Sabotage Theory. Was the world's largest radio telescope destroyed to hide atmospheric research? The Arecibo Observatory in Puerto Rico, for 53 years the largest single-dish radio telescope in the world, collapsed on December 1, 2020, when one of the steel cables supporting the 900-ton instrument platform above the 305-meter dish failed, causing the platform to fall and destroying the dish. The collapse was the culmination of months of structural deterioration that had begun in August 2020, when an auxiliary cable slipped from its socket, damaging the dish and leading to engineering assessments that recommended decommissioning. The National Science Foundation, which operated the observatory through an agreement with the University of Central Florida, announced in November 2020 that the damage was beyond economical repair and that the observatory would be decommissioned. Before controlled decommissioning could begin, the second cable failure occurred and the platform collapsed. The conspiracy theory, the structural failure, was not accidental but deliberate sabotage, specifically targeting the observatory's capability to detect or interfere with covert atmospheric modification programs. The theory attributes the collapse to entities who wanted to eliminate a facility that could have provided independent detection capability for ionospheric modification activities. The engineering investigation of the Arecibo collapse found specific mechanical causes: degradation of zinc within the cable sockets due to a design that prevented proper load distribution, leading to progressive cable failure under the weight of the instrument platform. The failure mode was consistent with known deterioration mechanisms. The timeline of cable failures matched the progressive loading of the remaining cables after the first failure, and the engineering analysis was consistent with an accidental structural failure rather than deliberate sabotage. Arecibo was not specifically equipped to detect atmospheric modification programs, and its detection capabilities in this respect were not unique. The theory requires a motivation that doesn't match the facility's actual capability. Story 25, Dubai Floods 2024. When a country that openly seeds clouds gets an unprecedented rainstorm, the April 2024 Dubai floods produced one of the more epistemically interesting situations in recent weather modification discourse. A country with a real, active, publicly acknowledged cloud seeding program experienced an unprecedented rainfall event, and the question of whether the seeding contributed to the flooding was immediately and widely raised. The storm that produced the Dubai flooding was associated with a deep Mediterranean low-pressure system that moved into the Arabian Peninsula, a meteorological situation that, while unusual in intensity, is a recognized regional weather pattern. The rainfall totals were genuinely extraordinary. Approximately 254 millimeters fell in a 24-hour period, roughly twice Dubai's average annual rainfall occurring in a single day. The UAE National Center of Meteorology stated that no cloud seeding flights had been conducted on the day of the storm, or in the 24 hours preceding it. UAE meteorologists attributed the event to the large-scale atmospheric system, and noted that even without seeding, extreme rainfall events from this type of system are possible, though historically rare for the region. The theory that the seeding program contributed to the flood was widely circulated and has specific plausible components. If flights were conducted in the days before the storm event, during the developing system, could seeding have contributed to the exceptional depth of precipitation? The answer depends on atmospheric conditions, timing, and the specific effects of any seeding that occurred. Conditions that are technically addressable but that require access to flight logs, seeding records, and meteorological data not publicly available. The Wuwei has the world's most sophisticated cloud seeding program outside China. It had a genuinely extraordinary rainfall event. The question of contribution is physically non-trivial, even if the specific operational records suggest the seeding was not the primary driver. Story 26, Henan, China, 2021. Did cloud seeding go wrong and end hundreds, then get covered up? In July 2021, extraordinary rainfall struck Zhengzhou, the capital of China's Henan province and surrounding areas. In a single hour on July 20, the city received approximately 201.9 millimeters of rain, more than the city's average monthly total for July. In a 24-hour period, total rainfall exceeded 617 millimeters, more than the city's annual average. Flooding ending over 300 people, inundated the city's subway system, and caused severe infrastructure damage across the region. Chinese meteorological authorities attributed the extreme rainfall to a combination of factors: a typhoon system to the south, lifting warm, moist air into the region; topographic enhancement, as the moist air was forced upward over terrain to Henan's west; and the persistence of the rainfall-producing system due to blocking high-pressure patterns that prevented it from moving. The meteorological analysis placed the event in the context of increasingly intense precipitation extremes associated with climate change. Following the disaster, online claims circulated suggesting that cloud seeding operations had contributed to the extreme precipitation and that this had not been disclosed. These claims pointed to the Zhengzhou cloud seeding cannon operation that had reportedly been active in days before the event, and suggested that seeding into an already saturated weather system had produced a catastrophic outcome rather than the intended modest precipitation enhancement. Chinese meteorological authorities denied that cloud seeding contributed to the flooding and maintained that the seeding operations in the region were not relevant to the Zhengzhou event specifically. The physical question of whether seeding into a deep moist system can amplify precipitation beyond intended levels is not obviously false. The specific effects of seeding depend on atmospheric conditions and could in principle produce more precipitation than intended. Whether this occurred in Henan in 2021 requires specific operational and meteorological data. The Chinese government's incentive structure does not favor disclosure of seeding-related complications. Story 27, the Bermuda Triangle weather weapon theory. Magnetic anomalies and the Navy testing site claim the Bermuda Triangle is an area of the northwestern Atlantic Ocean in which ships and aircraft have, according to the popular mythology that developed in the 1970s, disappeared at rates greater than in comparable ocean areas. The mainstream assessment of the Bermuda Triangle, that the disappearance rate is not statistically elevated when compared to equivalent ocean regions, and that the incidents within it are explained by conventional weather, navigation error, and human factors, is supported by Lloyd's of London insurance data and by the U.S. Coast Guard's own analysis. The specific fringe version of the Bermuda Triangle narrative that involves weather manipulation, that the anomalous events in the area are caused not by mysterious supernatural forces, but by a hidden U.S. Navy testing facility conducting weather modification and electromagnetic weapons experiments. Under this theory, the compass anomalies reported by some pilots, the unusual weather patterns, and the disappearances are caused by active experimental weapons effects, rather than the mundane combination of weather, geography, and human error. The theory has a structural appeal in that it replaces a supernatural explanation with a conspiratorial but technical one, which is actually the more parsimonious explanation for people who reject the supernatural but want to retain the anomalous status of the triangle. The documented reality is that the Bermuda Triangle sits in a region of the Atlantic with known geological and meteorological characteristics, including areas where methane hydrate release from the ocean floor can in principle destabilize ships, and weather patterns that produce rapidly developing severe weather. The U.S. Navy conducts extensive operations in the Western Atlantic, but maintains standard naval installation infrastructure, not a hidden weather weapon testing station. The theory is more sophisticated than many Bermuda Triangle explanations, while being no better supported by the specific event record. Story 28, Kakhovka Dam, 2023. Was Ukraine's flooding made worse by covert weather manipulation? On June 6, 2023, the Kakhovka Dam on the Dnipro River in southern Ukraine was destroyed, releasing the reservoir behind it and flooding extensive areas of the lower Dnipro Valley, inundating cities, towns, agricultural land, and natural habitats across a large area of southern Ukraine. The destruction of the dam occurred during the ongoing Russian invasion of Ukraine, and the question of responsibility, whether Russian forces destroyed the dam or Ukrainian forces did, became part of the information war surrounding the conflict. International investigations, including analysis by open-source intelligence organizations, concluded that the available evidence was most consistent with an internal explosion, suggesting Russian military responsibility, though absolute confirmation of responsibility has not been established in a neutral international forum. The fringe theory relevant to this collection, that the flooding caused by the dam's destruction was amplified by simultaneous covert weather modification operations that increased rainfall in the affected watershed during the period of the flood, extending the flooding further than the dam failure alone would have produced. The specific meteorological context around the Kakhovka disaster, June 2023, was a period of above normal rainfall in parts of Ukraine, consistent with the broader climate pattern for the region and with ongoing research on how climate change is affecting European weather patterns. The combination of dam failure and elevated natural precipitation produced more severe flooding than either factor alone. Whether weather modification operations by any party contributed to the elevated precipitation in the Kakhovka watershed during this period is not supported by specific evidence. The theory represents an extension of weather modification claims into an active conflict zone where attribution of almost any event is contested by multiple parties for political purposes. Story 29, the Great Lakes Engineered Snowbelt Theory. Decades of lake effect snow as a domestic test lake effect snow is one of the most dramatic, localized weather phenomena in North America. When cold, dry Arctic air masses move across the relatively warm Great Lakes, they pick up enormous amounts of moisture and heat from the lake surface, and that moisture falls as heavy snow on the downwind shores, sometimes measuring meters of snow over periods of days in narrow geographic bands, while areas just kilometers inland receive little or nothing. The snowbelt communities downwind of the Great Lakes, the eastern shores of Lake Erie and Lake Ontario, the western shores of Lake Michigan, experience some of the heaviest snowfall in North America on a regular basis. Buffalo, New York, averages approximately 2.4 meters of snow annually. Communities in the snowbelt have adapted their infrastructure and culture to this extraordinary precipitation. The theory, lake effect snow intensity, has been artificially enhanced through decades of covert cloud seeding operations using the Great Lakes as a natural moisture amplifier. And the communities in the snowbelt have been unknowing subjects of a domestic weather modification testing program for cold weather technologies. The physical mechanism proposed is partially coherent. If silver iodide or other seeding agents were introduced into the cold Arctic air masses as they crossed the lakes, the enhanced nucleation could in principle increase the efficiency with which lake moisture was converted to snowfall. The specific communities downwind would experience the effects without knowing the cause. The difficulty is that lake effect snow intensity is well explained by the natural variability of lake temperatures, ice cover, and air mass characteristics, and has been extensively studied as a natural meteorological phenomenon. The observed trends in lake effect snowfall are consistent with documented changes in Great Lakes ice coverage and water temperature rather than with seeding operations. Story 30, Project Skyfire. The Forest Service studied whether cloud seeding could prevent lightning wildfires. Project Skyfire was a U.S. Forest Service research program that investigated whether cloud seeding could reduce the frequency of lightning strikes that ignite forest fires. The logic was specific and worth understanding. a significant proportion of wildfires in the American West, particularly in the northern Rocky Mountains, are caused by lightning strikes during dry thunderstorms, storms that produce lightning and rain, but where the rain evaporates before reaching the ground due to the warm, dry air below the cloud base. If cloud seeding could modify these storm cells, increasing precipitation and ensuring that rain reached the ground rather than evaporating, the moisture would suppress potential fire ignition even as lightning strikes continued. The seeding might also reduce the electrical charge differentials that produce lightning, potentially reducing strike frequency. Project Skyfire operated from the 1950s through the 1970s, primarily in Montana and Idaho, and produced research that found some evidence of lightning suppression effects in seeded storms. The results were not conclusive enough to lead to large-scale operational deployment, and the program wound down as budget constraints and shifting research priorities redirected Forest Service resources. Project Skyfire occupies the same institutional space as Project Skywater, a real, long-running federal weather modification program that operated with limited public awareness, produced ambiguous scientific results, and was discontinued without dramatic public accounting. Both programs represent the sustained investment the U.S. federal government made in weather modification technology during the middle decades of the 20th century, an investment whose scale and seriousness is rarely reflected in public understanding of how weather modification history actually unfolded. The Forest Service was trying to prevent wildfires using cloud seeding. Decades later, catastrophic wildfires are being attributed to directed energy weapons. The gap between what was actually tried and what conspiracy theories propose is itself historically interesting. Story 31, 5G Storm Steering Theory, the Cell Tower Network, as a distributed weather weapon. The 5G Storm Steering Theory is an extension of the broader family of claims about 5G cellular technology, which include health effects, avian deaths, COVID-19 causation, and various other phenomena attributed to the specific frequency range used by fifth-generation cellular networks. The specific weather claim that the distributed network of 5G cell towers, operating in coordination, produces electromagnetic effects that can subtly redirect storm systems, effectively functioning as a distributed weather modification network that operates invisibly because each individual tower's contribution is small, while the aggregate effect is significant. The physics underlying the theory are not coherent with established atmospheric science. The electromagnetic frequencies used by 5G networks, millimeter waves in the high gauge range and sub-6 gauge frequencies in the lower range, interact with the atmosphere primarily through absorption and scattering of the transmitted signals, with negligible thermal or dynamic effects on the atmospheric systems that determine weather patterns. A storm system is a thermodynamic entity operating at energy scales that are orders of magnitude beyond the aggregate power of cellular network transmitters. The specific mechanism by which coordinated cell tower operation would produce directional forces on a storm system's movement is not articulated in the theory in a physically coherent way. What the 5G storm steering theory shares with more credible weather modification theories is the distributed, difficult-to-attribute character of the proposed mechanism. The theories that are hardest to evaluate are those in which the causal mechanism is distributed across a large, complex system, like a global cloud seeding network or a continental cellular infrastructure, where individual components are observable but aggregate effects are difficult to measure and attribute. The 5G theory uses this structural feature without the physical mechanism that would make it coherent. Story 32, the Aral Sea Engineered Collapse Theory. Was the world's worst ecological disaster deliberate? The shrinkage of the Aral Sea is one of the most catastrophic environmental disasters of the 20th century. Between the 1960s and the 1990s, the Soviet Union diverted the two rivers, the Amu Darya and the Sur Darya, that fed the Aral Sea, diverting their flow into irrigation canals to support cotton production in Central Asia. By the early 1990s, the sea had lost approximately 60% of its volume. By 2007, it had been reduced to a series of small remnant lakes covering less than 10% of its original area. The ecological consequences were severe. The fishing industry that had sustained communities around the sea collapsed. The exposure of the former seabed produced toxic dust storms from the dried salt and agricultural chemicals. Regional climate changed as the moderating effect of the large water body was lost, and public health in surrounding communities deteriorated significantly. The Soviet government's decisions to prioritize cotton production over the Aral Sea were made within the Soviet planning framework that consistently prioritized industrial and agricultural output over environmental considerations. The disaster was the predictable consequence of those decisions, understood in advance by at least some Soviet engineers and hydrologists who raised concerns that were overridden. The fringe theory that the Aral Sea's destruction was not an agricultural policy disaster, but a deliberate regional climate engineering experiment, that the Soviet Union intentionally dried out the sea to study the regional climate effects of removing a large Central Asian water body. The specific evidence for deliberate climate experimentation versus agricultural policy priority is not established in the available records. The Soviet decision-making around the Aral Sea's irrigation diversions is documented and shows the characteristic Soviet pattern of industrial priority over environmental consequence rather than the characteristics of a covert scientific experiment. Story 33: Japan's typhoon tracking infrastructure. Sophisticated monitoring or active deflection? Japan experiences some of the most intense typhoon activity of any nation on Earth, and has correspondingly developed sophisticated meteorological infrastructure for tracking, predicting, and preparing for typhoon impacts. The Japan Meteorological Agency maintains an extensive network of ground stations, weather balloons, radar installations, and ocean buoys, and operates advanced numerical weather prediction systems that produce typhoon track forecasts used across the Western Pacific. Japan's typhoon forecasting capability is recognized internationally as among the most accurate in the world. The JMA's typhoon forecast tracks are routinely compared favorably against other major forecasting centers. This infrastructure is publicly documented, and the forecasts it produces are publicly available. The fringe theory that Japan's typhoon monitoring infrastructure secretly includes active deflection capability, that the system is not merely observing and predicting typhoon tracks, but is using some component of the monitoring network to influence those tracks, protecting Japan's coastline from the worst typhoon impacts while maintaining the cover story of pure forecasting. The specific evidence cited for this theory is primarily circumstantial. Japan's typhoon deflection success rate relative to neighboring countries, the sophistication of its meteorological infrastructure, and the observation that some storms have tracked in ways that avoided Japan's main islands while affecting neighboring regions. The meteorological reality is that Japan's typhoon track statistics reflect the natural variability of typhoon paths, influenced by large-scale atmospheric steering patterns, the subtropical high-pressure system, the Pacific jet stream, and other synoptic features that determine where typhoons go. Japan's geographic position, the variability of those steering patterns, and the track statistics of storms approaching the Japanese archipelago are consistent with natural meteorological dynamics rather than active deflection. The sophistication of Japan's monitoring network is real. The deflection capability is not established. Story 34: Operation Cumulus Revisited. What we still don't know about the Lynmouth flood of 1952 and Operation Cumulus deserve a second story specifically because the investigation of the potential connection between the two is one of the better documented cases of researchers attempting to establish or refute a weather modification conspiracy using archival research and finding that the archival record is genuinely incomplete. Investigative journalist Anthony Barnett and researcher Mark Watts published investigations in The Observer and elsewhere in the early 2000s, drawing on documents obtained under Freedom of Information requests, witness accounts from former RAF pilots, and meteorological records from the period. Their research established several things. Operation Cumulus was real and was conducted in the general time frame of the Lynmouth flood. Some documents related to the program's specific activities in 1952 were either missing from archives or had not been released. Former pilots gave accounts consistent with flights over southern England around the relevant period. The Ministry of Defense's responses to these investigations maintained that no connection between Operation Cumulus flights and the Lynmouth flood was established in official records. Independent meteorologists who reviewed the question generally concluded that the meteorological conditions that produced the Lynmouth flood were unusual but consistent with natural extreme events and did not require cloud seeding to explain. What neither side has been able to do is produce the complete operational record for Operation Cumulus in 1952. The specific dates of all flights, the locations over which seeding agents were released, and the total quantities of material deployed are not in the public record. The absence of a clean documentary record is genuinely frustrating for anyone trying to evaluate the theory, because the honest answer is not this is definitively false, but this cannot be definitively evaluated from available evidence. 34 people died. A secret program was operating. The full record has not been disclosed. That is the specific situation, and it has not changed. Story 35, the question every weather control theory is actually asking, how much is already real? We've been through 34 stories. Project Cirrus, Operation Popeye, Project Storm Fury, Operation Cumulus, Fido, China's 37,000-person weather office, Russia seeding clouds over parade routes, the Waze cloud seeding program, the NMOD treaty that exists because weather weapons are real enough to ban, HARP and its forgotten sibling facilities, the chemtrail patents that are genuinely filed, the directed energy theories and the 5G theories, and the satellite steering theories that are not established by evidence. The question that all of these theories share, both the confirmed programs and the fringe elaborations, is the same question. It is not whether weather modification technology exists. It does. It has existed in operational form since the 1940s and has been deployed by multiple governments for military, agricultural, ceremonial, and water resource purposes. These are not contested facts. They are documented history. The question is where the boundary is. The question is, given that governments have modified weather covertly, given that governments have used weather as a weapon, given that the largest weather modification program in the world is openly run by a government that is also building enormous water infrastructure on the headwaters of its neighbors' rivers, given that the treaty prohibiting military weather modification has no verification mechanism, where does confirmed capability end and conspiratorial elaboration begin? The fringe theories on this list are not paranoid responses to nothing. They are what happens when the documented history is taken seriously and extended beyond what the evidence supports. The extensions are not well supported. The extensions are also not irrational starting points, because the starting points are real. The government that made it rain over Vietnam, the government that burned a town in Georgia trying to steer a hurricane, the government that runs a weather office the size of a small army. These are facts. What those facts imply about what governments are doing that has not yet been disclosed is the question that this whole list is actually asking. And the honest answer is that the question is not obviously wrong to ask.